Suppose you want to get closer to the truth. Most people think they do. What's the first step? For decades we've been told, be humble, doubt yourself, defer to others. But what if that advice, the very thing that sounds wise, is the reason truth keeps slipping further away? Imagine a man who never claims certainty. He questions every belief, suspects his own memory, and avoids strong opinions. Sounds virtuous, right? Now imagine a woman who's unshakably confident in a theory no one else believes. She ignores critics, breaks from consensus, and refuses to second-guess herself. Sounds arrogant, maybe even dangerous. But what if that first person never discovers anything worth knowing? And what if that second person wins the Nobel Prize? We've been taught to treat intellectual humility as a kind of moral enlightenment, the key to good thinking, good citizenship, even good character. But behind its soft tone is something darker, a quiet force that discourages conviction, penalizes confidence, and rewards paralysis. In this video, we'll explore how humility, praised as the highest intellectual virtue, may actually be eroding our ability to think, act, and see clearly. In the last decade, intellectual humility has become the darling of modern psychology and virtue ethics. Universities teach it, podcasts preach it, algorithms reward it. You're told to doubt what you know, soften your opinions, and always leave room for being wrong. It sounds wise, almost sacred, but let's look closer. Psychologist Mark Leary defines intellectual humility as a willingness to admit one might be wrong. In theory, that guards us against arrogance. In practice, it can do something far worse. It builds a habit of retreat. Philosophers Michael Hannon and Ian James Kidd argue that humility makes us more tolerant, less polarized, more empathetic to opposing views. That may be true socially, but the question here isn't whether humility makes us nicer, it's whether it makes us more right. And that's where the cracks begin. A 2023 study by philosopher Neil Levy, published in Philosophical Psychology, found that participants who were encouraged to be more humble started doubting even their accurate beliefs. Humility didn't sharpen their thinking. It made them less confident in the truth. Worse, many studies praising humility rely on self-reports. People are asked to rate how humble they think they are. But here's the catch. The more arrogant someone is, the more likely they are to believe they're humble. It's the paradox of the humble bragger. I'm proud of how humble I am. Still, humility is promoted as a universal epistemic virtue, a one-size-fits-all cure for misinformation, bias, and overconfidence. But truth isn't a democracy, and uncertainty isn't always noble. There's a difference between knowing you could be wrong and being too afraid to ever say you're right. And in today's world, where truth must compete with noise, timid thinking doesn't stand a chance. Barbara McClintock was not a humble scientist. She was a quiet, obsessive one, but never deferential. In the 1950s, she began presenting results that shattered two dogmas of genetics. Genes don't stay fixed on chromosomes, and their expression isn't rigidly determined. She discovered controlling elements, genetic units that could jump positions and switch other genes on or off. This was decades before epigenetics became mainstream. Her peers at Cold Spring Harbor responded with dead silence. Some mocked her work as mad. A collaborator, Harriet Creighton, recalled her 1953 talk fell like a lead balloon. Publishing didn't help. The field ignored her papers. Most scientists, faced with that level of rejection, would pause, recalibrate, and lower their claims. Intellectual humility would have told McClintock to listen to the experts, tone down her certainty, or abandon the project altogether. She did the opposite. She stopped presenting at conferences, decided publishing was a waste of time, and kept refining her methods in isolation. "I just knew I was right," she later said. This wasn't arrogance without substance. It was the stubborn self-trust of someone who saw something others could not. McClintock's approach was intensely personal. "I know every plant in the field. I know them intimately," she told her biographer Evelyn Fox Keller. She predicted what she would see in a plant's nucleus before looking under the microscope, and, she claimed, she was never wrong, except once. 30 years after that disastrous talk, she was awarded the 1983 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for her discovery of mobile genetic elements. The very crankish ideas dismissed in her lifetime became foundational to modern genetics. McClintock illustrates a brutal truth. Scientific breakthroughs often require not humility, but resistance to it. Had she been more eager to defer, to question herself, to wait for consensus, her discovery might have died with her notes. The paradox is clear. The intellectual humility we celebrate today could have erased one of biology's greatest insights. Simone de Beauvoir's The Mandarin stages the danger with surgical clarity. A defector arrives with documents proving Soviet labor camps. Henry studies the evidence, accepts it, and acts. Robert insists on withholding judgment. It would be irresponsible to judge with only the information to hand. Anne, confronted with the same material, shrinks back and tells herself she's too incompetent to protest. On the surface, Robert and Anne look like models of intellectual humility, open, cautious, conscientious. Underneath, Beauvoir shows a different motive: avoidance. Robert's doubt functions as refuge, Anne's modesty functions as retreat. They cloak cowardice in the language of epistemic virtue. This is the performative face of humility. It professes epistemic modesty while enabling inaction. Worse, it creates moral cover. I can't act because I might be wrong. It's an elegant dodge, ethical respectability without responsibility. The paradox is brutal. When conviction demands risk, whistleblowing, public warning, revolutionary science, timidity dressed as humility becomes a weapon against truth. Henry's apparent rashness looks noble only because he was right. Robert's caution looks contemptible only because he was wrong. But the moral texture shouldn't hinge on outcomes alone. If truth requires courage, then a structural norm that fetishizes doubt will systematically disadvantage those willing to take that risk. In public life, the pattern repeats. Scholars hedge claims to avoid controversy. Journalists offer both sides to avoid accusation. Institutions preach deliberation to avoid liability. Each hedge is socially rewarded. Each hedge makes decisive inquiry harder. This isn't an argument to glorify hubris. It's an argument to recognize a reality. Humility can be an epistemic virtue, or it can be an alibi. Beauvoir's characters teach us to read motives, not just manners. If humility becomes an automatic excuse for silence, it stops being a virtue and starts being a tool for evasion. Humility that paralyzes action is not noble, it's cowardice in disguise. There's a difference between doubting yourself and dismantling your ability to know anything at all. In a 2023 study titled Too Humble for Words, philosopher Neil Levy tested this line. Participants were primed to embrace intellectual humility, reminded of their fallibility, told to temper their confidence. The result? They began undervaluing even their accurate beliefs. Not only were they more hesitant to assert what they knew, they second-guessed truths they previously held, with good reason. The pursuit of humility had mutated into epistemic self-sabotage. This isn't a fringe finding, it reveals a psychological cost we rarely acknowledge. Forced humility can make thinking itself feel unsafe. We've moralized uncertainty to the point of paralysis. Instead of correcting errors, we preemptively doubt what's true. Instead of asking, am I right, we default to, who am I to say anything at all? Nietzsche saw this coming. In Beyond Good and Evil, he warned that so-called virtues are never clean. Every virtue has its price and its shadow, he wrote. Even humility, when praised too loudly, may mask fear, resentment, or the need to please. What looks like modesty may be the quiet death of intellectual ambition. Barbara McClintock didn't suffer this paralysis because she didn't perform humility. Her truth-seeking was fused with pride, intuition, and obsessive confidence. She didn't need external permission to pursue what she saw. The danger is clear. If humility becomes a default stance, we risk breeding a generation of thinkers afraid to think, afraid to commit, afraid to trust their mind, afraid to say, this is true and I will stand by it. Truth doesn't fear scrutiny, but it requires confidence to pursue, and confidence cannot grow in the soil of chronic self-doubt. When humility is enforced as a moral obligation, it doesn't refine thought, it erodes it. The problem isn't humility itself, it's the fantasy that any one trait can be universally virtuous, regardless of time, context, or consequence. Virtue epistemology, the idea that good thinking comes from good intellectual character, has a fatal flaw. It tries to moralize knowledge, but truth isn't moral, it's conditional, messy, and often inconvenient. Take McClintock. Her refusal to doubt herself looked reckless, until it wasn't. Had she been wrong, we'd call her arrogant. Because she was right, we call her brilliant. So which was it? Vice or virtue? The answer is, it depends, and that's the point. Treating humility as inherently good ignores what actually drives discovery: context, personality, pressure, intuition, and sometimes just raw obsession. Trying to define universal intellectual virtues is like telling artists which colors they're allowed to use. It doesn't work. What silences one thinker may empower another. What looks like humility in one setting might be cowardice in another. What looks like arrogance might actually be vision. Worse, the virtue model often punishes precisely the traits that lead to innovation: certainty, instinct, confidence in the face of disagreement. It assumes that error comes from ego, but ignores the errors born of fear and submission. In practice, virtuous thinking too often means polite, hesitant, deferential thinking. But truth doesn't emerge from politeness. It emerges from friction, resistance, pressure, and sometimes from people who are willing to be disliked. There is no universal blueprint for good thinking, because there is no single path to truth. And the more we moralize intellect, the less honest we become about how knowledge is actually made. Humility can be a grace, but when weaponized culturally, academically, or psychologically, it becomes a leash. It doesn't just hold arrogance in check, it holds truth hostage. In an age drowning in noise, we don't need more polite skeptics. We need minds willing to risk clarity, because real thinking isn't safe, and real knowing isn't always humble. So here are 3 things to remember. First, don't confuse doubt with depth. Uncertainty isn't wisdom, accuracy is. Second, practice intellectual courage. Not loudness, not arrogance, just the courage to stand by your reason when it matters. And last, question every virtue that asks you to shrink, especially the ones that sound the most righteous. Because in the end, truth isn't democratic. It doesn't need your humility. It needs your attention, your conviction, and sometimes your refusal to yield. If truth has enemies, doubt is often their most useful disguise. Let that linger. If this challenged what you thought was virtuous, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready for more, subscribe.